When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, and welcome back to the Rescom YouTube channel. In today's video, we are going to be continuing our reread. It's been a couple weeks, kind of had a little bit of a break off since I was doing a Christmas event, but we're going to be back. We're going to be doing Daenerys 1 today. Also, my hair is a little bit of a mess, so you're just going to have to deal with it. But this is a really strong Daenerys chapter. I think there's a lot of things I really like about this chapter. We really get to dive into Viserys, who I'm doing a video on this week about. We get to kind of look at Daenerys as a character and where she's at, setting the foundations for her character, and also exploring the Targaryens as a whole. How has their family come out of power? And a little bit more of the history of Westeros. Like I talked about in the last reread, we had a bit more kind of lore drops, just a little bit here and there to kind of walk us into our main Targaryen, Daenerys. And I think that is one of the things I really love about that chapter with Catelyn 1. So Daenerys 1, it's going to be a lot of lore. It's going to be a lot of starting the plot up and establishing some of our characters for book 1. But before we get further into the video, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do. It helps the channel grow. I like this content as well. And let's get into it. So the first thing we see of this chapter is Daenerys and Viserys. They're kind of talking, and Viserys is giving Daenerys this dress. Now, it's not actually from Viserys, but Viserys is kind of like handing it to her. And we are told that this is a very exotic dress. This is a very soft dress. It's one of the best dresses Daenerys has ever seen in her life. And there's this idea here that Daenerys seems like she doesn't understand why she's getting these gifts. And also that she doesn't seem like she gets nice things a lot. As we hear in this page, that she really has never felt like a princess, or at least for a while, which is for something very interesting when we look at deeper into this chapter. When Daenerys she is a Targaryen. She has a claim to the Iron Throne, especially once Viserys dies. But even then, if you look at the traditional Targaryen history, she should be the queen of Westeros. So it's a very interesting idea, the contrast to where Daenerys feels like must be some reason she's getting this dress, and she doesn't really feel like she deserves this, or that, I guess, feeling as where Viserys is different, or we'll talk about Viserys as we go through this chapter, where Viserys very much believes that this is his right. He deserves all of these things, no matter what the motivations are behind them. And it's a very interesting contrast where would Daenerys have been more like Viserys if she had known her father or her mother? It's a very interesting idea, and it's what really separates the two right from the beginning. And we learn that they have been staying with Magister Illyrio for on about half a year now, and he's never really asked them for anything. It's all very odd. And this is specifically when we look at later on in the series when, you have young Griff is also circling around at this point. It's an interesting idea here that he's not asking for anything. And Daenerys instantly picks up on this. Like, why is he doing this? We're not really in a position to give him anything. What is his motivation here? So we instantly see how Daenerys is a bit more mistrusting, and she's a bit more calculated. She understands that this stuff isn't normal, like what's going on here. And Viserys, he kind of brushes this off. It's a quick reasoning of, well, he knows that I'm going to take my throne and I will reward the people that help me along the way. And it's not a terrible rationale from Viserys, because you could make the argument that, hey, Illyrio can see that, hey, this is a gamble, right? If I'm helping Viserys now, maybe it really benefits me and comes to fruition later on. We know that's not really the case, and we also look at the person Viserys is. Illyrio's not stupid. He really doesn't believe in Viserys. But it's an interesting idea when you look at why Illyrio is supporting the two. And as we kind of go further into this chapter, we see really how Viserys is just incompetent. And you can tell from this first chapter, this is not a man you want to be king. This is not a person that really is going to be able to take Westeros. If you look at Westeros right now, as we've seen from a lot of the chapters before with Bran, and Catelyn, Westeros is kind of at a stable point where there's not really been a lot of warring. You have a lot of people in charge that seem like they're doing a good job of ruling the realm. We know that's not really the case, but from the outside looking in, especially with our very limited knowledge of the political atmosphere so far, doesn't seem like Viserys has the best chance. And I think someone like Illyrio would know that. And that will kind of bring us into page 29. Something else I want to note, just because it is put in the chapter, is that we do know that Daenerys is 13 as of right now. So Daenerys is a very young girl. And what we know is going to happen is that she's going to be married off to this warlord. Put yourself in that position of Daenerys where she's only 13. And then when you put in perspective on other things that we're going to learn, she's also been on the run since she's been 13, really. Or she's been on the run since she was born, more or less. It's an interesting idea, and it goes to really establish why Daenerys is the person she is as of right now, especially with the abuse that she has been suffering from Viserys. So as I talked about on the last page, this page kind of opens up with a little bit more of Daenerys, kind of her difference from her to Viserys, where Viserys kind of believes in this fairy tale that Illyrio's helping for this reason and that he is going to retake the Seven Kingdoms. Daenerys is kind of more on the lines of she's kind of listened to some of the common folk and the people in the streets, and she knows that Illyrio really would just sell them if given the right price. And it's an interesting idea that Daenerys doesn't even bring this up to Viserys. Daenerys is a very smart character for being so young. When you think about what she's going on in her head right now, where she's saying, you know, I'm not going to say this because it's going to get me in trouble. We see how many characters are arrogant in this book series or wouldn't have the same restraint. Think about Tyrion. He's a character that doesn't really have that restraint. Daenerys is someone that at this point has the restraint and knowledge to understand that she is not really in the position of power between her and Viserys at this point, and that she shouldn't really talk back to Viserys because Viserys is kind of saying, oh yeah, all these things like I've talked about. And Daenerys is kind of just sitting there like, yeah, that's exactly what's going to happen, Viserys. Yep, you're right. You're always right. Because she, quote unquote, does not want to wake the dragon. We're told that his anger is really bad. He has probably anger issues. And there's something else I think is very interesting that was brought up here. Daenerys says that Viserys almost has nervous hands. Now, could this be the idea of someone that's had to look over their shoulder, someone that has the entire weight and pressure of the Targaryen dynasty on their shoulders? It's an interesting idea and something we're going to talk about when I do my Viserys character analysis, because I think Viserys is a much deeper character than a lot of times he gets credit for. But with that being said, still not a great guy. And what we see is a little bit of what Daenerys is talking about when she means that she doesn't want to wake the dragon and Viserys is kind of angry. And we get an interesting idea here that Dany is going to be at least prodded about with Khal Drogo to seduce him. Or marry him is what we find out a little later in this chapter. And it's an interesting idea that Daenerys is only 13. It shows you how different this world is from ours, where this girl is a very timid girl. She really has not experienced much of life at all, and she's being married off. And this is just kind of how the world works in this system, where a lot of the time, a woman in the family is married off to help the benefit of the male. So, for instance, if we want to look at Robert's Rebellion, right, this was happening a lot. The Tully girls, for instance, they are being bookered to make alliances that helped Hoster Tully. It's usually not in the benefit of the woman, which is sad to say in a lot of these arranged marriages. Think about Lyanna and Robert. Lyanna didn't want to marry Robert, but it was A, for Robert's benefit because Robert wanted to marry her, and 2, for House Stark in general. There's a lot of interesting ideas that we can bring about in this story based upon that idea alone. Now, what we see here is Viserys definitely was attracted to his sister, and we see this multiple times. We'll find out a little bit more later on with Illyrio and Tyrion's conversations about Viserys specifically. But Viserys basically like starts feeling up his sister, and it's very awkward to kind of read when you really put it into context. And he more or less he's basically physically assaulting Daenerys. He basically grabs one of her nipples and just starts like twisting it. Like, Viserys is a very weird guy when you think about it. Now, again, if we really want to put it into context, it's kind of sick, but this is this universe. Targaryens do inbreed a lot. That's just a core value to their family. They want to keep the dragon lines within their own family. This was even more impactful back when there were dragon riders, because you didn't want to start bringing in Targaryen blood to everybody. Then the Targaryens weren't as special as how I think they viewed it, where, okay, if the Lannisters now have Targaryen blood, well, what stops them if they could claim a dragon or something along those lines, and keeping the bloodline pure, all that. So when you put that into context, maybe you give Viserys a little bit, but again, still not a great look. And he's kind of talking to Daenerys, basically he's basically taunting Daenerys, in my opinion, and just not being a good brother. Basically saying, he's looking for a different mount tonight, and that she smells like a horse or the stables. And more or less, Viserys is telling her, you're going to get cleaned up. We need you looking really nice. We want you to look like a princess with this dress, with jewelry. And that if he fails her, it's going to go very badly for her. And this is another indication of Viserys. I think Viserys almost feels very hopeless and almost the weight of the world on his shoulders for House Targaryen. This doesn't give him an excuse to treat his sister like this, but I think it's some of the inner psyche as to why he's putting so much emphasis on this, because for Viserys, he's viewing this as the moment he's going to get his army, the moment that their fortunes change and that they're going to go back to Westeros off the back of another man's army, and even an army that has never crossed the sea. So you really see how naive Viserys is in this moment when we get a little bit more of the information later on in the chapter. But it's an interesting idea that we see here with Viserys and Daenerys' relationship, and we see that this is a normal occurrence, which I think is even the more disturbing part of their relationship, is that Daenerys, this isn't an idea where Daenerys, and we come into the story where Viserys grows more angry at her, and these are things that are new in their relationship. This has been happening between the two for years at this point, and that is probably the worst part about their relationship. And another part of Daenerys as a character, and where she's going to go on this character arc of this entire book, is her growing into her own person. As of right now, she just takes it, right? She doesn't really say anything back to Viserys doing these things to her or saying these things. She just kind of swallows it and says, I won't fail you, and then Viserys leaves. And that will bring us into the last part of the page. And another thing that's very interesting to compare is how much Sansa and Daenerys kind of feel, and this little portion of their character arcs, where Daenerys is, after, Viserys leaves, kind of listening and looking out at Pentos and hearing, kids play and the Red Priest sing, and she wants to be really anywhere else but here, but going to this feast with Khal Drogo and introducing her to him. She really wants to be a kid. She wants to experience life and how a normal person would be able to go about that, not having the stress of being hunted by Robert Baratheon or the stress of being a Targaryen princess. And it reminds me a lot of Sansa, where Sansa wants to be a kid. She's still believing in all the good knights and the noble and chivalryness of the world. And it reminds me a lot of that, because Daenerys also at the very end of this page kind of talks about how there's going to be all these knights and things across the land. So there still is that naivety of Daenerys, but it's not as much as someone like a Sansa, where, Sansa has not experienced a lot of the hardships that Daenerys has faced. Again, we've talked about this a lot, but Daenerys being abused, Daenerys being on the run, having not really a set home, Her parents are dead. She really has no other family, no one she can really trust outside of Viserys, and we already see how Viserys treats her. It's a really interesting idea where Daenerys, yes, is growing up faster than a lot of people her age, but she's still a child at heart and wants to experience that. And that's something that I think we talk about a lot when we look at Daenerys as a character. Even further on down in the line, where I don't think Daenerys really wants to be the queen of Westeros. I think it's come and kind of put into her head now that she has to. She has to avenge her family, has to do these things. But I think Daenerys, at heart, really wants to go back to the House of the Red Door. We're going to talk about that in this chapter. We're going to talk about that in a lot of chapters where she constantly is thinking about that. And I think it's this idea of having a home is something that Daenerys has never really had. And it's something that we get a little glimpse of at the end of this page. Now, moving on, we will head into page 30. So we start page 30 kind of like with a little bit of a lore drop, learning about the Dothraki, and also learning, more importantly, in my opinion, what really happened in Westeros, why Daenerys and Viserys are even here, how old both were when they had to leave and go into exile. And we learn here that the Targaryens lost their seat of power. We got that, I think, hinted about in Catelyn 1. Not 100% sure how much they gave us in Catelyn 1. I don't remember. It's been about a month since I've actually read the chapter. But we learn a bit more here. We learn that not only did the Targaryens lose their seat of power, but they lost Robert's rebellion. And this goes a lot to motivate Viserys. This is a lot more about Viserys' character than Daenerys, where we're learning why Viserys wants to go back to Westeros, why he's so motivated to do certain actions, and that we even have this line where you do not steal from the dragon, which is, it's a really Targaryen line, you know? It's something you could see so many Targaryens in history saying, like an Aemond, One-Eye Targaryen, Daemon Targaryen, a lot of these characters saying lines like that. It's a really Targaryen line, just to put that in perspective. And then we have this idea that Viserys was 8 when they had left King's Landing and kind of Westeros as a whole. And this kind of goes a long way because, one, it shows us that Viserys did have a little bit of a childhood and how he and Daenerys are different in that way, where Viserys grew up believing that he was in the royal family, that he wouldn't necessarily ascend the Iron Throne, but he was very important, and that his family was important above all, and that everyone should bow to them. He saw the early workings of that. And the downsides of that is he had a father figure that was terrible. That wasn't really a father figure. The same way we talk about Joffrey and Robert Baratheon can kind of be applied to Viserys and the Mad King, where I think a lot of what Viserys is motivated by is, one, trying to show his father that he is a good man, someone to be proud of. It's something we see with Joffrey, where Joffrey tries to work on Robert's like violent side. We see a lot of violent and rash tendencies from Joffrey. We see a lot of those same tendencies with Viserys. And I think that is one of those things where in Viserys' situation, it probably would have been better that he had no parental figures. His mother kind of, in my opinion, babied Viserys to a degree, very similar to the way Cersei babies Joffrey. There's a lot of ideas here that are very similar between Joffrey and Viserys. And Daenerys doesn't really have either of those. Daenerys doesn't have these figures of a father figure, a mother figure. She was only a baby when she left Westeros. She doesn't remember any of their home, quote unquote, like Viserys does. It's why the two characters are motivated quite differently. If Daenerys had been brought up in King's Landing and had gotten to see her family's dwelling and her home a bit more, maybe she would be a different character too. Maybe she would be a lot more similar to Viserys than she is at this point, because Daenerys has had to grow up much quicker than Viserys had to. Viserys, yes, has had to grow up quite a lot since, he left Westeros and the fall of his family, but it's just a different situation, and it goes again to show the differences between the two. Now, to finish out this page, we kind of talk about Daenerys and her being born on Dragonstone, and how when she was born, there was a major storm, And this kind of wrecked a lot of the Targaryen fleet that had been at Dragonstone, and also that in the birthing process of having Daenerys, her mother died. And it's again something that we see that Viserys really never forgave her for, and this was really kind of the last Targaryen outside of Daenerys and Viserys at this point. And that kind of leads us to Daenerys and Viserys' flight away from Dragonstone. And in the next page, we'll kind of explore their journey past that. One other thing I did want to note before we got further into page 30 and 31 is that we also learn here how her father died, that the Kingslayer had killed Daenerys. So page 31 is a lot about Daenerys' journey after Dragonstone and how her and her brother Viserys struggled in Essos. And they start with William Darry helping them get out of Dragonstone, right? The garrison at Dragonstone was at this point ready to sell them to Robert Baratheon. At this point, the war wasn't looking good for the Targaryens. It wasn't even a war anymore. Really, you just had the last two surviving Targaryens. There's no real point of continuing this war, and that's how most of the garrison saw it, except for William Darry and a few men. Now, they would have, again, depart, get out of Dragonstone, go for the Braavosi coast, and for a little while, this is where Daenerys would live, and this is where we see really her only illusion of what a home could be like. She remembers being at this place in Braavos with a red door. She had her own room with a lemon tree outside. Now, a lot of people have kind of disputed this claim. It doesn't really make a lot of sense because we're told that lemons don't grow in Braavos. Now, I do think there is some evidence to counteract that. I'm not going to get into the whole theory in this video, but I did want to bring it up because it is an interesting tidbit and is the first mention of the red door that we do hear of. Now, what this signifies and represents is what we've talked about already in this video, is that this is kind of Daenerys' only real feeling of home, somewhere she remembers as a home when she was very young. And it's very important to note that it's a very driving part of Daenerys' character and her motivations. Now, eventually, William Darry does die, and their servants steal some of their things, and Viserys and Daenerys are kicked to the curb. So can you imagine this as a young child? I mean, Viserys at this point is still not very old. He has to basically look out for not only him, but his sister. And also, there is this overarching fear that you're being hunted by Robert Baratheon, that he wants you dead. And Daenerys notes that she never saw any of these hidden assassins that Viserys said, but Viserys, whether there was assassins coming after them or not, it does make sense that you would be this paranoid. That one day you're going to be sleeping here, and people are going to bust down the door and either kill you or sell you off to be killed. And it's something they have to live with with a very young age. And the amount of emotional turmoil and stress this causes from a day-to-day life where you're always on the move, you're never able to slow down. It's a very tough life that Daenerys and also Viserys start out on. And it's something that I think helps Daenerys through a lot of her struggles in the early part of this book. Having those experiences and being able to already be toughened up to the world to a degree really does help her and make her a stronger person. And we move towards this idea of slowly becoming more and more desperate, where Viserys, at a certain point, they're so desperate and that people are not taking them anymore because at the beginning of it, it's like, yes, these are the last two Targaryens. People are fascinated with them. Maybe they come back into their throne and this will be remembered. It's kind of like the Illyrio situation, but it makes a bit more sense at such an earlier time when the Targaryens had just fallen. And Viserys has to start selling their mother's possessions, things that were very valuable to their family, just to survive. It's a heartbreaking thing when you read it that all of their family possessions are gone. They really have nothing. And this leads Viserys to start getting called the Beggar King. And it is a rough way of showing who Viserys is as a person, because he still believes in himself. He still believes that one day they're going to go back home and take their home. And when you're living with that attitude at such a young age, it does kind of come off as a dream. And he gets that name of the Beggar King. And Daenerys even notes, like, what do people call her? You know, I couldn't even imagine. But what we're getting off of this page is a little bit of sympathies towards Daenerys and Viserys, as they've had a really tough life. And a really shit hand to start out their lives. And we end this page and go into page 32 with the whole idea that separates Daenerys and Viserys. Is that Viserys says one day we will have it all back, and we will go back and get the silks and the treasures of Westeros and King's Landing. And Daenerys just wants to have a home. She doesn't want those things. She wants to feel comfort and not have all of these stresses and be able to live in one set area. It's very human in that way, that she wants security. And that will lead us into page 32. Now, this next page doesn't have a ton of significance. It's a page really of Daenerys being prepped, cleaned, and basically given a bath before she's to be basically made all pretty to look for Drogo. Now, what we do note in here is there's a little bit of gossip going on about how big the Khal Drogo's Khalasar is, who Khal Drogo is. So we're getting a little bit of like information dumps about what Khal Drogo and what to kind of expect. That he's kind of this barbaric warlord, more or less, that he's a demon archer, that he's one of the best warriors in the world. And there's this interesting idea that comes from this page that we kind of talked about a little earlier in the video. This idea that Viserys believes that the Targaryens should only marry into each other. He says they should keep the lines pure and that they do not mate with the sheep. And what's interesting here is Daenerys always figured, even Daenerys, that she was going to marry Viserys. Now, what is an interesting idea here, and Daenerys even notes that herself, is that desperation and trying to gain power, how that will change your ideals and how it will change you as a person. Where there's always this idea that power corrupts. And we see it here a little bit with Viserys, where Viserys has these very bold ideas. They're not even bold, actually. It's really just passed down from his family and generations of this stuff. But Viserys is this firm believer that we should keep the bloodline pure, but then instantly is trying to marry his sister off to Khal Drogo to gain an army to take back Westeros. It's this whole idea that when things actually come to push and shove, people will change their ideals to survive. And that is the interesting part, and something that I think George is really trying to play on when looking at Viserys and this whole marriage idea. Something else to note here is the idea that Daenerys likes her bath hot. She likes being in the heat. It makes her feel comfortable, right? And we know that there's a difference from the way the show portrayed Daenerys, where the show went with she's like fireproof, she's just heatproof. And that's not really what the book goes for at all. The book is more like she just has a resistance to heat and fire a bit more than a normal human being does. And that's kind of what we see here, where maybe this hot bath or hot water would be scalding and be really hot for a normal person, but for Daenerys, this is just comfortable. And that's, I think, what George tries to show us here, and it's a little bit of foreshadowing to what will eventually happen at the end of the book with the hatching of the dragons. And that's really what we get here. Also, we learn that there's no slavery in Pentos, but these are slaves, really, that are helping Daenerys. So there's some interesting things that we learn here, but this is a cleaning up page of Daenerys, and also just kind of learning a little bit of gossip and maybe what is to come later on. Page 33 continues with kind of wrapping up this whole idea and getting Daenerys into her princess, basically, costume. And Daenerys notes that she really does look like a princess. Like, she feels like one. She has a little tiara on. She has a nice dress on, kind of similar to the way the picture looks in the background. She's all dolled up, like she's ready to go. And something else I wanted to note, especially about gossip. This is kind of not our first indication by George, but our second indication that people like to glorify things in this world. Where it's said here that Khal Drogo's slaves, he's so rich that they have golden collars. Now, this is a weird idea to be celebrating, because they're still slaves, but yet in this society, being a rich slave is better. Like the slaves that we see with Illyrio are like, wow, that's amazing. And it's a really interesting idea that I just wanted to bring up, that this is still an awful system that people are being enslaved, but they can try and see positives in it, which is, I think, an interesting idea. But that will continue into the next part, where Daenerys again interacts with her brother and also Illyrio. To finish the rest of this page, we get Daenerys kind of being basically paraded before Illyrio and Viserys. And I think there's an interesting part of here that I want to talk about, where Viserys kind of tells her to give him basically a turn, and he's like sitting here like, I feel like almost in awe of his sister. And he's about to say something like, she looks good or something like that, and Illyrio cuts him off. So we get this idea that if Viserys does think she looks pretty good, he's almost left speechless to a degree. And Illyrio kind of finishes his sentence, just to kind of, I feel like, have them not go down that route. And Illyrio's like, yeah, she looks great. She looks very regal. She looks, wonderful, and just really intoxicating Daenerys with these compliments. And it kind of shows the person Illyrio is. Illyrio is a flatterer. Like we're going to see with Robert Baratheon in the next chapter, where he feels like he's just around people that are fools and flatterers. It's really what Illyrio is to the public, to people like Viserys. He's a flatterer. And he does a lot of this in this moment. And then he's kind of cut off by Viserys, who says she's too skinny. Now, this is an interesting idea here, because I think in this moment, Viserys is actually jealous that he is not going to marry his sister. Because we just got this idea that he actually did probably think she looked very good, but then all of a sudden he's now criticizing her. I think in this moment, he realizes who Daenerys is, or what she could be as a princess, and is taken aback by it, and is trying to degrade Daenerys. And it's an interesting idea when you're playing on the idea that Viserys initially was supposed to marry Daenerys, and that's what he wanted to do. And now he's going to have to give away his sister to Drogo. And he's a little salty about that. I think he is someone that doesn't like the idea of having to get rid of something valuable to him in his mind to someone like Drogo. Getting rid of having the blood of the Targaryens being mixed with these nasty horse lords in Viserys's mind. And I think that's the way he kind of views this situation, and why he kind of takes a step back on this. And then we have Viserys kind of asking Illyrio, and this is going to kind of continue into the top of page 34, is the idea of, is Daenerys too young for Drogo? When this concludes, we see how Daenerys is around her brother. And when he lets go of her hand after asking kind of this question to Illyrio, Daenerys' hand is trembling. She is someone that at this point does not have a lot of confidence in herself. She is someone that fears her brother and is not kind of awoken from that circle yet. And what we see here is that Illyrio is basically like, she's blooded. She's perfectly good to go now. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, as long as she is able to get pregnant and all that, perfectly fine. Again, remember, Daenerys is 13. Like, very weird talks about a 13-year-old being blooded. And also, Illyrio notes that Daenerys looks the part. She has the silvery hair of the Targaryen. She has the purple eyes. She's literally the definition of a female Targaryen. And Illyrio notes that. And what I think is an interesting idea is showing how well Illyrio understands how to play the game with words. Where Illyrio kind of has a slip up here. Where Viserys is kind of saying, these Dothraki, they sleep with anything. Boys, sheep, horses. And Illyrio kind of has a sly remark where I think Illyrio, even in the moment, kind of was just sitting there going like, dude, are you really this stupid? Where he's just like, you better not say it to Khal Drogo. And Viserys is like, what did you say? And if we look at someone like Sansa, where when she's talking to Joffrey, how she handles the situation, or handles her situations, think about how Illyrio handles the situation. He instantly kind of goes back on it, but he gives Viserys compliments. He flatters him, and he keeps Viserys on an unbalanced level where he's like, wait a minute, this guy did kind of call me stupid, but also at the same time, he's calling me the king, and he's calling me, you know, all these things. It's an interesting idea to show how dangerous Illyrio can be as a person and how he can win things with his words and not necessarily his might or even his gold to a degree. And I think that was a really interesting idea that's brought up here, and to show how Viserys that can't really look past those things, while Daenerys, on the other hand, can. Also, sorry for not changing the page number, I just got it done, but we are on page 34. Now, the remainder of this page kind of explores Viserys, Daenerys, Illyrio. They're all heading towards this party dinner that Drogo is hosting. And we learn that kind of Viserys in this moment he's for one fidgeting with his sword. And Dany kind of notes that he's never used that thing in his entire life. So this very much is reminiscent to a kid that's first using or learning how to use a sword. And we can tell that Viserys really has not had any training. Just by the way that he fidgets at it. He doesn't seem like he's used to having a sword on his belt or anything along those lines. And it's something that's interesting to note about Viserys on how kind of, I guess, nervous he is while on the outside, not really showing it in the way he speaks. And then Viserys starts talking about, we won't need their entire Khalasar, which is very true. If somehow Viserys was able to get this Khalasar army, and these Dothraki across the sea, they really wouldn't need that much. There's a scene in the TV show talking about the Dothraki screamers, and if they were to invade, it's very true that the Dothraki would pillage and destroy Westeros, and it would eventually force, really, Robert to have to meet them at some point. And trying to defeat a Dothraki army out in the open at the field is almost suicide. So I think Viserys is correct that 10,000 Dothraki screamers would probably be enough, alongside the idea that Viserys is not completely wrong, that people would not flock to his banners when he went to Westeros. It's the manner in which he went to Westeros. If he's coming over with an army and he looks like he's in reasonable control and has some shot of posing a threat to Robert's reign, yes, the Dornish could possibly come over to his side. We know that there was this idea that Viserys and Arianne were going to marry. So there is an idea that, yes, this could have worked if it could happen. But the idea of the Dothraki ever crossing the sea for Viserys is never going to happen. And that's something that I don't think Viserys truly understands. It shows his lack of understanding of their culture. It shows his lack of understanding of people in general, that they're not going to just take an entire continent for you just because you gave them your sister to marry. Like, it's very naive of Viserys and shows kind of how he doesn't really understand politics or people as a whole. And Viserys, after going through this whole speech, kind of has this reasonable doubt. And he's like, Illyrio, aren't they? Aren't they, waiting for me to come over and to take the Iron Throne? And Illyrio's like, of course, darling. Of course they are. And us, the audience, are just looking at this and just doesn't seem like what we think. Because, we've already seen, right, through Bran and Robb, the North doesn't back them at all. So it's interesting, an idea where, as a reader at this point of the story, we don't know if this is true or not, but it just seems the way it's phrased that it's probably not. And it's something that Illyrio, again, is just bluffing and flattering. And what I think is interesting is that Illyrio, even kind of off to the side, is like, well, so my spies say anyway. It's one of those things where it's it takes pressure off Illyrio if he was wrong, which he knows he probably is, by saying that little sly remark. So I thought that was an interesting little remark, again, showing Illyrio's cunning. And that will get us into page 35. And what I think is very interesting is that we continue to understand that Dany sees the world and people much better. And maybe not in a better as in a good light, but in a more realistic light. as Viserys now is going on, and he's like, I'm going to kill the usurper Robert Baratheon, and I'm going to kill the Kingslayer for what they did to my family. And Illyrio is just kind of nodding along. Oh yeah, that'd be so fitting. And he kind of has like a little smirk on his face that Viserys doesn't even see. And Daenerys is the whole time just thinking while this is going on, I don't have any spies in Westeros. I've never even been to Westeros, but I highly doubt what this man is saying, and she just doesn't trust him at all. And Daenerys even notes that Viserys at this point kind of seems like a child. Like in his mind, he's imagining going off to the Battle of the Trident and slaying Robert Baratheon and avenging his brother. It still shows some of that youth of Viserys and how young he still is and how he is still living in this fairy tale, and he hasn't really woken up to the world. And to a degree, Viserys has. You know, he understands there's bad people. He understands people would try to kill them and sell them and all these things, but he isn't seeing the world for what it really is. Not a fairy tale. I would paint Viserys almost in the male light of how Sansa enters the story with all of these fairy tales. And I think that's a really good comparison for the two. But as we continue, we eventually get to this Manse of Drogo's, and it's in 9 stories. And we get another little information dump into kind of how the Dothraki do business. So this Manse was given to them by the Magisters of Pentos as this kind of gesture. It's like they kind of believe that, yes, we would be able to survive an attack by the Dothraki. They could sit behind our walls and just wait it out, right? But their idea is, why take the chance? They're already so rich. Why enter combat with the Dothraki when you could try and get them on your side? And there's also this underlying idea here that Illyrio says that he kind of believes them better than the Dothraki as savages and barbarians. And a constant thing we see when looking at the Dothraki from outsiders, and it's something that Dany starts to refute and understand their culture, which is another amazing part of this first book, and Dany as a character as she learns about them. But it's this idea that the Dothraki, because of how skilled they are militarily, they can get a lot of things without actually having to commit violence, which shows a lot of, I guess, big brain power, and showing how they themselves are actually pretty smart and how they use their numbers, their reputation to gain things that they may not gain otherwise. But I think that's an interesting idea and kind of explores more of the Dothraki culture before we're really introduced into them. And as they're getting to this Manse, they're kind of stopped, and this Unsullied comes out. So this is our first definition of kind of the Unsullied are. They're described as like a eunuch with this spiked cap, and very different from what the Dothraki are supposed to look like, while this man from the Unsullied doesn't have any, hair, while a lot of the Dothraki do. And it's our first little indication of what is to come, as they are discriminated against by Viserys. Viserys, really, without any indication, already has his hand on his sword, like, ready to attack. And Daenerys again notes that this is kind of Viserys being nervous. Viserys is visibly, from Daenerys' point of view, looks unsettled. On the outside, he looks the way Daenerys feels on the inside. Because remember, Daenerys is coming to this to meet the person she is going to be married to, or she's going to fail, and Viserys is probably going to abuse her. So, very lose-lose situation right now for Daenerys, and it's understandable that she is nervous. But more or less, Illyrio talks to this Unsullied, and they get in, and Illyrio is basically like, yeah, I mean, we've got to make sure you don't get killed or something, and you're going to have a lot of enemies, that the Khal, has to provide certain homage, or I guess protection, for Viserys. And Viserys is kind of just like, yeah, Robert Baratheon, he's tried before, his hidden knives are everywhere, they've been following us. And this may or may not be true, but it's just another insight into how Viserys kind of feels and how he's thinking and how he's kind of always on edge. And that will take us to page 36. So the next page is the 3 entering, and they're announced into this Manse. And it kind of seems like an empty gesture. That it's one of those things where it's like, they announce, Viserys as being king and all the titles as just kind of a nice gesture. just to not piss him off or give offense. But it definitely feels like an empty entrance. And so Viserys, Illyrio, Daenerys, they enter this room. And there's a lot of people from everywhere. There's sellswords, there are Dothraki here. And through all of this that's going on, Daenerys realizes, to make the situation even worse for her and make her feel even more uncomfortable and nervous, there's no women here, which we know is kind of part of Dothraki culture, and it makes sense. And in this world, women just do not have the same power men do, and they are looked upon differently, and their status is different. Now, the Dothraki culture is quite different in the way they treat women compared to maybe Westeros, but it is an interesting idea, and it goes again to build her unease. But one character kind of doesn't fit the bill of the rest. Illyrio says that there's a man named Ser Jorah Mormont, and this piques Daenerys' interest. For Daenerys, this has to be really interesting, because she has not actually met any real knights, and this is someone from back home where they lived, and this definitely piques her interest as Daenerys kind of asks, why he would be here, and Illyrio kind of says he's kind of in trouble with the law. Robert wants his head, and that he got into a little bit of slavery. And that kind of takes us into page 37. Now, this page continues with the talk of Ser Jorah Mormont, and Viserys, more or less, is just like, slavery's alright. He shouldn't have gotten punished for that. Interesting sentiment by Viserys. Definitely not a good idea, but Viserys is like, I want to talk to this guy at some point, which makes sense. He could learn a lot from Ser Jorah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So the next little part of this is Daenerys, at the same time, is about to be pointed out, or Drogo is about to be pointed out to Daenerys. Illyrio kind of shows him to her. And another thing I wanted to talk about is Jorah's description. So Jorah from the show is much different than Jorah in the books. Jorah is described as being older, not really that attractive, kind of looks like a bear. He's very hairy. He's not at all what Ian Glenn was on Game of Thrones. Like, he's just not attractive at all. And that's what makes it even more creepier as their relationship kind of develops later on in the story. But it is something to note that also Jorah is very fit. He's very strong for his age, and that is something to note. And as we were kind of talking about how Drogo is about to be introduced, Daenerys feels like she wants to run and hide. She's scared. She doesn't want to meet this person. These are all normal feelings of a young girl. And it just shows more and more of how she is going to change as a character from her first chapter to even her last chapter in A Dance of the Dragons, where she is someone that just is not confident right now. She is not this person that is happy with herself or confident in herself. That's something she's going to grow into in this book particularly. And our first description of Drogo is a pretty impressive one. Drogo is really a foot taller than anyone else in the room, which is saying something, because you have Dothraki blood riders in here, you have a knight in here. He is a big man. And the weirdest thing here is something we talk about with the Mountain. He's also quick. He moves with the grace of like a panther, as it is described in the book. It's a very vivid and very impressive description of Drogo. And Illyrio at this point goes, I'm going to go, talk to him and bring him over to you. So this is kind of the moment that has been building up to in the entire chapter. Viserys is really eagerly and nervously awaiting this moment, and Daenerys feels like she could probably explode from nervous energy. And Viserys does not help. And the last part of this page is Viserys basically going, yeah, you see that braid there? You see how long it is? That means he has never lost a battle, which is insane. So this braid and his hair going down his back, as we can see in the kind of the picture, doesn't really show his backside that well. But this is a man that understands war. And that is what makes him so appealing for someone like Viserys. If Viserys can use Drogo, because Viserys, thinks he is someone that is above Drogo. He thinks he is of higher blood. He's the king of Westeros. He thinks he can just use Drogo as an instrument of war. And as we'll find out, that isn't the case. But again, we haven't even met Drogo. And his reputation, his description has already shown us that this is a very intense man. And something else I didn't even mention when I was talking about Drogo's description is that Drogo is a very kind of good-looking man. I mean, he's no older than 30, and Daenerys marks this is a decent-looking guy. So, a lot going for Drogo, and that will lead us into the final page of the chapter, page 38. And we start the next page with Daenerys sees that this is a man that is cruel, that he looks like a hardened man, and she is much more afraid of Drogo than she ever has been of Viserys. Where Viserys is a twisted, abusive person, this is a man that is just physically intimidating. He's probably a good 2 to 3 feet taller than her. As we look at the picture that I have in the background, that is probably an accurate depiction of what it looks like. Daenerys is looking way up to this guy. It is a very intimidating prospect. And at this point, Daenerys kind of asks for help. I don't want to marry this man. I don't want to be his queen. And that's not the answer Viserys wants to hear. Viserys sees this as his last attempt, really, to gain any power and to take back the Seven Kingdoms. And she also notes something that really triggers Viserys. She says, I want to go home. Now, home means two different things to two different characters here. Where home for Daenerys really means any place that is safe, that is comfortable, and she can live a normal life. Home for Viserys means King's Landing. And Viserys takes this quite a different way, as we'll see in the following paragraphs. And at this moment, seeing his sister really in distress, what does Viserys do? In his stress and his determination to win this man to his cause and this army and take back his throne, he more or less starts digging into Daenerys' arm and basically whispering, because again, they're in a very public place. And Drogo and Illyrio are over there. They're about to start walking over towards them. And Viserys is like, how are we going to go home, Daenerys? Like, we need an army. And the way we're going to get that army is by you marrying Drogo. And he goes even further, saying some pretty messed up stuff to your sister. Especially when you think about it from this idea that I think Viserys is jealous that Drogo is marrying Daenerys, where he basically says, I'll let the whole Khalasar have you. And that is something that's crazy to say, just to get this army to maybe go across the sea, and that's a maybe that they win. It's a crazy thing to say to your last blood relative. And it really shows Viserys' desperation, how afraid he is. The pressure has gotten to him. And he, at this point, he's not a good person. And he's really despicable. And he's really put the fear into Daenerys that you should be more fearful of you screwing this up for me than of marrying this guy. That's what Viserys' game is right now. And it does work. Daenerys, had started crying, but, she dries her eyes and all these things. And they see that Illyrio is bringing Drogo over. And Viserys doesn't stop here. He's basically, again, insults her even more and belittling her, telling her to stand up straight, to show off what little breasts she has. Crazy statement to be saying, especially when you're her brother. And two, giving her all the confidence in the world. But, yeah, so basically she does what Viserys says, turns around, smiles, and tries to stand up straight. And that is where the chapter ends. This chapter actually doesn't cover their actual meeting. It really just ends when she sees him and they're being approached, which I think is a weird spot to end this chapter, if you want me to be honest. But this is the longest video of the series so far, and I really enjoyed this video. I know a lot of people, have asked me why I don't like Daenerys' point of view as I like other characters, but I really like Daenerys in the early part of her story, and I really like her dynamic with her brother. and her kind of coming of age story where she grows more confident with herself. She's something that I think Hollywood has strove to make as a character, because Daenerys was beloved on Game of Thrones. They don't understand how to get there. Daenerys is a character that's very flawed. She's someone that's being abused, someone that has flaws, that is trying to get through them, and will grow as a character as we go on. Even when she, comes to be confident with herself, she is someone that has struggles with other things that she's not experienced with. So thank you guys for watching this video. I want to say a massive thank you to Matthew, who gives me all of these images and gives me a good supply of things to choose from so that you guys have something to look at while I'm doing the video. So I want to say massive thank you to him. He is one of my mods. He does a great job for me as always. And I'm really excited to do Ned 1 next week. Ned 1 to me is my favorite chapter so far that I've read on my reread. But thank you guys all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.